Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Still Standing podcast, hosted by Daniela Galdi, the founder of Still Standing Together, a support and empowerment organization that helps you get back on your feet. The Still Standing podcast offers you interviews, guidance, and solutions through everyday struggles and mental health improvement. Welcome, everyone, to episode 19 of the Still Standing podcast. It's me, your host, Daniela Galdi, the founder of Still Standing Together. And today I had the fortunate opportunity to speak with the beautiful mind of Kira Yakubov, who is a individual, couples, and sex therapist in the Philadelphia area, where she owns her private practice. She helps clients struggling with anxiety, self-worth, relational distress, and cross-cultural challenges gain powerful insight into how their past experiences and relationships are continuing to hold them back today from living an authentic and fulfilling life that they deserve. Authentic is definitely the key word because we focus this episode on shame. And what I first tell Kira when we start talking is, I know what it feels like to feel shame, but by definition, I don't know if I could explain it to somebody else. So we go in depth talking not only about shame, but also about shame versus guilt, shame and its effect on mental health, shame and trauma. We talk about boundaries. We talk about toxic relationships, unhealthy and healthy family dynamics. We talk about the difference in cultures. Kira herself has grown up as a refugee from the Soviet Union, which she'll talk more about her experience, as well as her experience growing up with parents who were immigrants. We'll talk about projection. What is projection? We'll talk about the positive approach of projection, visualization, decision making, building self-awareness. We touch on so much with Kira, and that is part of her mission, the transformative healing that begins with developing self-awareness, mindfulness, and becoming compassionate with ourselves and others. So as an immigrant herself, she was raised in a culture that was oppressive towards women's roles and sexuality. And so she is passionate about helping her clients and our listeners find and assert their voice without any shame. I can personally relate to Kira's experience growing up feeling different, growing up from an Italian family where I would go home and my family spoke a different language. We had different traditions. It was different. And then going to school was also a different experience. And this is something Kira talks more about, and how you start to become confused and start to hide yourself. So one of the big focuses of empowerment I really hope that our listeners get from our interview and our conversation together is that you don't have to hide who you are. And that acceptance of yourself can help you to give the world your goodness and your talents, because we all need you here and we need what you have to offer, and no one person is going to offer what you can. So I really think what Kira talks about relates on so many levels for us all, especially with relationships. Towards the end of the podcast, we do get into more about relationships and communication and how feelings can be triggered from our past and our childhood growing up. It's all related, and aside from shame, it does bring me to feelings that we all can experience of fear and not wanting to maybe rock the boat or push ourselves out of our comfort zone or upset anybody. So shame really has a underlying thread that can force out many different mental health distresses and difficulties. According to a mental health article by psychologytoday.com, shame can create mental distortions as it isolates people from reality, causing fear and paranoia on top of any other mental issues a person may be experiencing. So as you get a deeper understanding of what it's like to live with shame and a deeper understanding of boundaries, mindfulness, living with that fear, living with that shame, living with that guilt that holds us back from expressing ourselves and from being who we are. I hope that that deeper explanation can help you to come out of hiding and be your true, authentic self that we all need you to be. Hi, Kira.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for doing this today. I'm actually really excited for our listeners to hear about your background and everything you have to teach us about anxiety, but also shame, because like I told you earlier, shame, I can feel it, but I don't know if I could ever explain it. So you mentioned there's a few things with shame. So we're going to get into that later. But first, I want you to definitely share with our listeners who you are, about your background, and things you've had to overcome in life.
Sure. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I've gone through sex therapy training as well. And so I own my own private practice right now in Center City for just a little under a year. My background is I came to America when I was 2 years old from Azerbaijan, which was part of the Soviet Union. So I speak Russian. Many people haven't heard of the country, so I usually just say I'm Russian because that's easier for people to understand. But we came here during the fall of the Soviet Union, so there was a war going on, so we came as refugees. So I was basically raised by all my family members with some form of unhealed trauma. And nobody knew. I didn't know growing up. They definitely didn't realize it. It was just about surviving coming here. And so it was really hard to assimilate and kind of integrate these two identities I had, where I would go to school in America. And so even down to the lunches, everyone had peanut butter and jelly, and I would come in with a piece of lamb and a whole tomato and pickle.
And you and I, this is what we bonded over. One of the things when we first met, because my parents are from Italy. And so I said, you had lamb and I had chicken cutlets and lasagna and stromboli.
And I also wore a fur jacket to the first grade in the winter.
So you stood out.
Yeah, I definitely stood out. And so I realized that I was different from everybody from a very young age. And then I would come home and it was like a completely different world and an environment. I was the youngest. I'm the only girl of three. I have two older brothers. And as a female in that culture, you're supposed to basically be trained to be a wife and mother. So from a young age, I was always told that no sex before marriage, and marriage is really important. And I was supposed to make tea for my dad every day, whenever he wanted, and kind of cater to the males in the family. And the women were to be taking care of everybody, and our opinions were not necessarily that important. There was plenty of love and affection, so I don't want to make it seem like we were abused or neglected, but there was definitely a gender stereotype big time.
So could you tell us more about the stereotypes and how that made you feel?
Sure. So I think that's kind of when my shame began as a little kid, is that I realized how different I was treated between me and my brothers. Is that I was supposed to help my mom clean and cook and take care of everything, and the boys were just supposed to do the manly things, so like take out the trash or protect me if anyone was bullying me, which happened a lot. Um, and there was a really deep part of me that wanted to rebel. Like, that made me really angry. It seemed very unfair. Like, why? The answer was always because you're a girl. Because you're a girl, and that's what you're supposed to do. You have to be ladylike. You have to make sure that you're respectful and you listen and you're obedient. That was a big one. And that like went against everything that I felt inside. I wanted to be a little tomboy. I wanted to wrestle and I wanted to run around and get dirty, and I didn't care about those things. And so I realized like there must be something wrong with me then. Like, if I'm supposed to be this girly girl and I don't want to be, then something's up, like something's wrong. And then going to school in America, I realized that I had to like split my personality into two, basically. It's like when I would go to school, I needed to fit in, right? I needed to be cool, and I wanted to go to sleepovers and like boys and date and all those things. And then when I had to come home, I had to be a different person. So I would constantly be hiding half of myself no matter where I was. So that really developed a lot of shame, a lot of insecurity, and I felt like if either part of my life found out about the other, I would no longer be accepted or like worthy of love or friendship or anything. So I needed to play a role in each place. And that became really exhausting because there was no like just Kira, like just an integration of the two. It was always splitting between me.
Wow. So what was it like when, school friends maybe came home to your house, or how did you manage that playing these two different roles and then them coming into your world at home?
Yeah, so that was interesting. So it was always a shock for everybody about the meals we had and my parents just speaking another language or having a very thick Russian accent. I was embarrassed sometimes, for sure, but that was just like the norm for me at home. So I preferred to go to other people's houses, and they had snacks and all these different things, and it was like a completely different world, and like their parents hung out and we were like talking to them, whereas I didn't really want to share that part of my life as much. I mean, my closest friends got to see it and they understood just because they were around it so much, but I wasn't allowed to go to sleepovers. Like I said, my parents went through a lot of trauma coming to a new country, so like they didn't trust people, and they really instilled in us not to trust others, like to be very skeptical and fearful, and whatever happens at home needs to stay at home. Like you don't share with the neighbors, anybody outside, what happens at home. So that also made me feel a lot of shame. Like I had to hide more things. I could never just be myself. I was constantly thinking about like, can I talk about this? Can I not talk about this? Should I lie about it? So it was never just present. I was always concerned about what am I saying? How am I acting? How are people going to accept me? And it was exhausting. And I developed a lot of anxiety and depression through that time.
And I want to back up a little bit too, because you said it was hard, things were left unspoken. How old were you again when you came to America?
So I was 2.
You were 2, so you don't really have a memory of what physically happened. Did
No.
your parents ever talk to you about that situation, of anything they went through or were feeling when they had to, escape and come here?
Yeah. The common phrase at home was, I don't know why I brought you to America.
Wow,
When
yeah.
I was a teenager, especially, like drinking and going out and staying late at night, because it was such a completely different world there. Like when we came here, there was military tanks driving down the middle of the street shooting at civilians. And my parents would tell me like my dad walked outside and there was like body parts outside. And when my mom was pregnant with me and had to give birth, like my dad had to pay the ambulance to come to our neighborhood and pick her up to take her to the hospital because it was just so bad. It was so dangerous. And there was nothing we could really do. I mean, that was just the life there. So everything was about coming to America because it's better than what was happening there. And coming here, not knowing the language, not having any money, having to basically be on welfare for a while, my dad working all these crazy hours, different jobs, not knowing the language. Like, that's nuts thinking about it now. And he was just a few years older than I am right now doing that with 3 kids, a wife, his mom, and mother in law.
Wow, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a lot to really handle.
Hmm.
Now that you have grown up in America and you've all been here for over 20 years at
Hmm.
least, do you feel like you can talk a little bit more about growing up and what you were feeling, which we'll get more into, but what you were feeling as a child?
With them. Yeah, I mean, now for sure they become Americanized as well at this point, right? Like I think if they went back there now, it would be completely different. Like it wouldn't even feel like home for them. Growing up, I couldn't really talk to them about it because they didn't understand. Their struggle was always harder, and I get that because it was. But my experience was still hard for me. It
Yeah.
was just stories about what they went through, but I couldn't remember what it was actually like. I just knew that this sucks. This is hard for me. Nobody else can relate besides my brothers, but they're 2 older brothers, right? And we're kids. They're beating me up. We're always fighting and yelling. So I didn't have anybody I could really talk to about any of this and feel understood.
Right.
So I just went to my journal. I journaled all the time.
I love that. It's actually so interesting, and I brought that up about the talking, and now that it's been so long since they've been there, because again, that's how you and I connected so quickly. Is that my parents are from Italy, and I'm the fourth of three daughters, or excuse me, I'm the fourth of four daughters. But so. And they really wanted to take on the American culture and things like that. So but it was the same thing growing up in terms of emotions. I did a lot of journaling too. And also I was always at other friends' houses, and I always, was kind of angry, like, why do we have to be so different from everybody else?
Yeah.
I was afraid. I felt the two-role thing. I was afraid to always tell my parents things. Well, same thing. They are loving, and I could have talked to them about anything, but I was just, there's a fear. Right. And I asked you that about from then to now, because now I look back and I wish I would have appreciated it more, because as I got older, I started to really value the fact that I had a different culture growing up, and I wanted to learn more, and I felt like I missed out on a lot. So I feel like I'm playing catch up now with my parents and my Italian culture, so that I can continue those traditions.
Yeah.
And so I don't think children are listening to this, or teenagers listening to the podcast, but maybe for any parents or anybody, any grandparents listening, that they do hear what you're saying about your story and what we're both saying, and encourage their grandchildren or their children to talk with them and try to find the value in it, even though you do feel so different that you just want to feel normal like everybody else, but it ends up being a really special thing to grow up this way. So if you could actually, tell us a little bit more from there. So you're a therapist now. You weren't able to talk, but now you're helping people talk. So after, you got older, what happened when you decided to, express that you wanted to do what you're doing now?
Growing up, I never really knew what I wanted to do, like, when I grew up, right? But I always knew that I loved helping people. That was like, all my friends would always come to me, and like, I enjoyed it. Like, I liked being able to help. It gave me a purpose, and I loved human behavior and learning about it. I just remember, like, I would go through these like periods where I would learn everything about one specific thing. Like, the one time it was just psychopaths. I would just read books and watch documentaries, and it was just so intriguing for me, because I loved just understanding the human brain, because I just couldn't understand what was going on in my life or my own feelings. So I was like, oh, let me just read about other people's experiences. So that was always something I enjoyed, but in my culture, mental health is not really understood well. And being a therapist isn't like a real job. That's something you do to help crazy people. And if you go to a therapist, you must be absolutely nuts. And if you are, you don't tell anybody about it, because that's shameful. Because people are going to know you're crazy and they're not going to want to be around you. So it's another thing. A lot of my culture is the sense of belonging. And if there's something wrong, you won't be accepted. So that was a lot of like lying and hiding and pretending to be someone you're not. And so I remember going to my dad. I was like, Dad, I don't know what I want to be. And he was like, well, you're good at math. And an accountant is it's a good steady job for a woman. And your husband will make more anyway. So just do that. I was like, okay. So I went to school to be an accountant. And
he says that in the most loving way too.
Of course.
Yeah. But as someone, but I get it, because you're like, okay, that's your way of thinking, but mine's a little bit different,
Yeah.
So sorry to cut you off, but continue.
No, that's a good point, though, because I know he said it from a very loving place, but that's the culture, right? Is that's just what's expected of women and men in that way. So I went to Drexel for accounting, and I did fine. My grades were fine, and then I had an internship at a tax firm. And I remember coming home the first week crying because I absolutely hated it. Sitting in a cube all day, not speaking to anybody, and only working with numbers, for me, felt soul draining. And after that, I just minored in psychology because I enjoyed it and I loved learning more about it. And I would get all A's in those classes, and I started failing my accounting classes. And there was a certain point where I was like, all right, I should probably switch or stop taking psychology, because it's really messing with my other grades. And I told my parents that, and they were very against it, because what are the things we hear about this? You're not going to make any money. You're only going to work with crazy people. You're going to be in debt. Like, who even wants to do a job like that? And it sucked hearing that. And there's parts of me that were really angry, and other parts were like, well, maybe it's true. And I remember my brothers were like, listen, do some research. Tell me what kind of job you can get. Tell me the steps you need to take to get there. What's the plan? And then we'll convince the parents that it'll be a good idea. And so I'm thankful that I had very supportive brothers. And the other part, like the feminist part of me, is like, why do I need two boys to convince my parents what I want to do with my life? But it did help me research, and then I realized, like, oh, this is very attainable. I need to go to school, I need to go to grad school, I'll do this, I'll become a licensed therapist, I can own my own practice, I can make money, I'm not going to starve, it'll be okay. And so then my parents were like, okay, fine, if that's really what you want to do, then do it. And I switched, and I am so thankful and grateful that that happened.
Wow.
Because I love my job. I really do. It's so rewarding. I get to live my dream right now. I make my own schedule. I help people. I get to talk about things that are emotionally and mentally stimulating for me. And it's so rewarding to see somebody who feels like they're suffering alone to no longer feel like they're alone and understand themselves better.
And that is why I love you. And I love you for being part of Still Standing Together and helping everybody a part of it and who's listening. So you said two really important things. One is that clearly you found something that feeds your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that was very courageous of you to have to confront, especially knowing that your parents might not have had might not have been behind you on
Mm-hmm.
it, but they were. They ended up being
Yeah.
behind it. And although you had to, go to your brothers first for the support, you said the second really important thing, which was attainable. So you found what fed your soul, and then you recognized that for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
it was attainable, regardless of years of hearing girls can't do this, girls can't do that, girls do one thing, girls do this thing, boys do that thing, just black and white.
Yeah.
You still were able to go and make sure that it was, you found a way to make it attainable.
Mm-hmm.
So I commend you on
Thank
that.
you.
That's amazing.
Thanks.
With that said, I want you to tell us a little bit more about your roles now. So you mentioned back then you had two roles. It was Kira at home, Kira in school.
Mm-hmm.
So now tell me about your roles. Have they blended? You as a therapist, you as a friend, you as a daughter. Where is that at now as an adult? And what kind of work have you had to do to get to wherever you're at?
That's a good question. My roles. So I felt like before, even when I knew I wanted to be a therapist and went to school, was that my role was still the helper and the fixer and the saver. And I think that I clung to that because I felt like that was my only purpose and that's what I could provide in relationships. And if I didn't have that, then I would be useless because I didn't have other skills the way we talk about like different jobs, right? So if my skill is helping people and if I can't constantly do that for every single person around me at the detriment of my own health, then I'm useless. And if I'm useless, then no one's going to love me and I won't belong and I'm all alone.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I've been there before where it spirals that way.
Mm-hmm. And going to grad school for marriage and family therapy was mind-blowing. Like I wish that this was taught when we were in high school because the amount of knowledge I learned about myself and my family and just people in general, I don't think that only therapists should learn this. Like I think everybody should learn these kinds of things. I learned what boundaries are and like unhealthy and healthy family dynamics and different roles that we play and we get stuck in because if everyone plays a role, then the system stays the same, right?
Wow.
And that's comfortable.
Right.
And what's familiar is comfortable and it gives us a sense of control. And if even one person in the system, and the system could be a family, it could be a job, a team, it's a group of people, right, that are together. And if one person decides, I no longer want this role, it shifts the whole system. And not everybody else wanted to change. You did. And so that means everybody else naturally has to adapt and they resist because what's comfortable is what's familiar is comfortable. And so if everybody has to like switch things around, then everybody else has to change and try new things. And they're comfortable where they are. But that's not always healthy for everybody else involved. So when I started realizing that my only purpose is not just to be the fixer or take on everybody else's problems, I started creating boundaries with people and my family especially. And that was really hard because I felt a lot of shame and guilt and just thinking like this must be really wrong. Like I thought I was being mean or rude by choosing me to create some space between what I wanted. It wasn't just about my life wasn't consumed by everybody else, but there was a portion where I was allowed to just do what makes me happy. So now I think my roles, I don't think I have very distinct roles. I think that all my relationships are different, and sometimes it's hard for me to pull apart Kira versus therapist Kira because I became a therapist because this is how I think, and I think this way because I'm a therapist. So it's kind of meshed in, but there's definitely like differences, right? Like sometimes in my relationships, I don't want to just therapize people. Like I don't want to be like, well, this is what's going on with you, right? Like nobody wants to be analyzed all the time. So I'll just try to just be me as just a friend, not a therapist.
But because you have boundaries, you
Mhm.
understand other people's boundaries as well.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. And if not everybody wants advice, not everybody wants to hear what I have to think. So sometimes I'll just let people talk and vent because most of the time that's all we really want to do is just have someone who's going to be there with us, who's present, listening, and just validating our experience. Like, yeah, that sounds like it's really tough. And then if they want advice, my friends know, they'll ask, like, what do you think? And I love in my friendships right now because even when we're feeling a lot of emotions, we'll check in first. Like, hey, I'm having a shitty day. Are you available and do you have like emotional energy to hear this right now? Or can we like talk about it later? And I think that's so powerful because that's a boundary. Like, that's showing love. Like, hey, I know I'm going through something, but I don't want to dump it on you. But if you're available, I will, right? It's like checking in. So it's being able to hold these two things, my feelings and respecting other people's feelings. And that could be really hard.
And I think definitely, and I think that it's such a great point. I'm glad you're mentioning it for the listeners because it's a great tool to practice in communication. And I'm sure you find this when you're doing your sessions and working with people on their relationships with other people. So I want to backtrack a little bit, and if you can explain about boundaries, because when you were saying once a person realizes for themselves, myself included, so I can understand what you were going through, you set these boundaries and then, like you said, you start to feel like you're a bad person. So just if you can explain an idea or what boundaries are and then how to overcome that feeling of feeling like a bad person when you're shifting and implementing these boundaries in your life.
Yeah. So I think it's tough because it's going to look different for everybody. But I think the biggest thing is that when we start to feel resentment or anger or drained, worn out, that means we have not set a boundary. Because think about when we feel resentful, right? It's because we're doing something and we probably don't really want to be doing it, or we feel like we're not going to be appreciated for doing that thing. So there's an expectation there that if I do this, then you'll give me this in return. And many times people don't even know that that's what's going on in your head, right? Like, and I was doing it because I thought I had to, because if I keep giving, then I'll receive love and feel worthy. But I was giving because of that reason and not because I actually wanted to do those things all the time. So I think first just kind of checking in with yourself, like what are you feeling constantly? And when are you feeling these feelings and around who? Because there's probably certain people that bring it up more within you and in general too. So if you're feeling drained or resentful or irritable, then I think it's important to check in to think like, okay, like why is this coming up for me? And what is not being spoken to the other person so that they could actually know how I'm feeling? And sometimes they know. that it's draining you, but they're more focused on their feelings. So that can be, I think that's the toughest part too, is that when people push back on it because it's been the norm for so long, right? So like if you call me every day and I talk to you and one day I just don't want to do it anymore and you call me and I'm like, I'm busy, I don't have time. Well, what the hell? This is what you're supposed to do. This is your role. How dare you take that away now? So I think it's really important is just becoming more mindful of what's happening for you and allowing yourself to check in with yourself and then exploring, why is this feeling coming up for me? Like, where am I not setting a boundary? Am I not letting the person know that this is no longer a good time for me to talk? I'd prefer a different time. And then having them shift to that. Because boundaries really are, it's not like a wall to keep people out. I think that's a huge misconception, is that if I put up boundaries, then I'm not letting anybody in, I'm keeping people at a distance. But really, it's how can I love myself and you at the same time without creating this negative feedback loop? So when we look at it that way, I think it becomes a little bit easier because you can hold both of them. It's trying to balance. We'll never have a perfect balance, right? But like working towards a good balance where they can feel like we're considering them and we love them and we care for them, and we also feel replenished, right? Like we're also still taking care of ourselves too.
Right. And you said you are one who wants to help and things like that. So you're still able to help share that compassion, but not, as you said, deplete yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I can think back to when I had one of my businesses, and this was something at the time I was speaking with a life coach, and this was something that she had me practicing were my boundaries, and it was extremely hard for me. But I had clients calling me at like midnight, which was unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Unacceptable for me, unacceptable for my partner. It was not okay.
Yeah.
And I remember it was really hard for me to vocalize it at first, so I would just not answer.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas usually I would answer immediately. So that was like the first step. So they didn't have to know for me.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point I did have to vocalize it.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're saying that it's important to vocalize it so that the other person is aware that you're still considering them.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's a hard thing to do.
It is. It's really hard.
But eventually you start to find that like courage, and you start to feel like power. You feel
Mm-hmm.
like empowered and powerful, that you're like, no, I'm like, this is better for me and I like this feeling.
Yeah.
So the feeling becomes, takes over of that feeling good.
Yeah.
So,
but I also think to keep in mind is that we're also helping the other person too. We don't think about it that way.
no.
But we're teaching them something. We're teaching them how to treat us, and we're teaching them how to treat other people. And when we want to, especially in my case, when I wanted to help and save somebody, is that I'm taking away the opportunity for them to figure out how to help themselves, right? So when we are quick to rescue somebody because we don't want them to feel something bad, we're taking away that opportunity for them to feel empowered to take care of themselves. Because we have consequences are just a natural part of life. And when we try to save people from their own consequences, we're really doing a huge disservice to them. So it's also part of not enabling people, is that I'm not going to tolerate this behavior. And I know you're upset about that, but you will find a way to manage and deal with it so that you can grow as well.
Wow. Yeah, that's such a great perspective. I love that. Because then it does, again, it can snowball into what you said, like enabling, things like that. It's a great perspective.
Hi everyone, Daniela here. Before we enter into part 2 of episode 19, take a moment to reflect or pull out your journal to check in with yourself on why you are feeling resentment, anger, shame, or frustration. Why is this feeling coming up? And where are you able to set better boundaries for yourself to start to live more authentically and true to who you are?
I want to go into a little bit more about the shame and the anxiety that you face, and that how to help the listeners who are facing this, especially those who have grown up in a very, I want to say the word suppressed, but that's not maybe the best word, but how would you describe how you grew up? Very controlled environment, or?
There was control, and there was There was a lot of suppression. Like, you should suppress how you're feeling because it's not, I don't want to say it's not important, but if no one knows how to feel their feelings and you're emotional and you're having feelings all the time, it makes everybody else uncomfortable. So, in order for them to feel more comfortable, I needed to hold my emotions in and keep it for my journal. Really.
And that makes sense why you are very good at journaling, because I want you to share some journaling prompts with others listening when we get there. So,
Sure.
but before we get into a little bit more of that, is this something that you work on in your sessions with people? So if somebody's thinking like, oh, okay, I'm having this situation in one of my relationships in my life, what would they expect in a session? Because I know for me, I'm a huge believer in therapy, but when I was in a state of depression, it was not easy for me to just jump right in again.
Yeah.
What can you share with them to expect that you'll go through with them? For example, let's say one individual knows they're having an issue in a specific relationship, let's say with their romantic partner. Maybe they don't feel comfortable going in together with the person. So how can they approach it as the individual in a session, in a marriage, and specifically geared towards what you focus on, like marriage, family, sex, things like that?
Sure. So I think the first thing that I always start with my clients is building self-awareness, right? Because even if you think, oh, you go to the mechanic, like, he needs to know how the car works first and what's going on before he or she even tries to start fixing it. Sometimes we just want a quick fix because what we're feeling is really uncomfortable. And therapy is not a quick fix. Unfortunately, I know a lot of people don't like hearing that, but it's not. It's a process and it's a journey. So the first thing we would do is exploring what is coming up for you around this issue, right? Like, what does this issue mean for you? How long has it been going on? How do you end up reacting when this comes up? What do you feel in your body? How does your partner behave around this issue too? Because we end up creating a feedback loop, right? So if I say, let's say for example, the issue is like household chores and we're constantly arguing, and this is a perfect example. I'm messier at home, right? My fiance is very neat and clean and I'm messy. So I could come home and just leave everything out, and then he can come home and say, I can't believe you didn't pick up after yourself. And so that triggers inside of me memories of when I was younger, of shame, of not doing something right, of kind of being like someone being critical of me, right? So I'm going to respond in a similar way to him that I did when I was younger, of getting defensive and feeling like he's attacking me. And so I'm going to end up pushing him away. And then he's going to feel resentful that I'm not considering his feelings or his space. And then it goes back and forth. So it's not about the dishes, right? The thing that's happening is typically not what's really happening. It's the underlying cause. So what's happening right now is that I'm triggered to feel inadequate in that moment or unworthy of love because I'm messy and there's something wrong with me. And he's feeling resentment because he thinks that I don't care about what he feels and how it's impacting him. So until we take the time to realize, oh, that's a trigger for me, and then I can communicate like, hey babe, like, when you say things in that tone or in that way, it brings me back to when I was little. And when I feel that way, it makes me feel shame. And when I feel shameful, I become defensive and want to hide and pull away from you. And I know that's not good for the relationship, but that's what it reminds me of. And so if he can recognize that it's not about him or what I'm doing towards him, but that reaction brings something up in me, then that feels easier to work with than you don't consider my feelings and you're being a jerk. So I think it's really about checking in. What is this bringing up for me? How does this make me feel? How do I end up responding? And how can I share that with my partner without blaming them, right? I could have easily said like, well, when you come home and you talk to me like that, it pisses me off and then I don't want to do the dishes because now I'm rebelling, right? You're blaming somebody else for your actions. He just triggered something. He's not the problem. The point that I even have that trigger is something I need to work on.
It brings up such a great point about communication and just having a self-awareness on how we communicate with one another. So you mentioned shame. Does seem like it's a very common emotion that you feel. So can we get into that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So with shame, if you could just give our listeners, because as I said in the beginning, I know when I'm feeling shame, but I don't necessarily know if I could define shame in words. So can you explain about shame a bit more for us?
Sure. So I think the basic premise about shame is that we inherently feel like there's something wrong with us or how we look or how we behave or how we think, and therefore we feel unworthy of love and acceptance. And so that's a really painful feeling, right? That there's just something in us innately that is just defected. And because of that, we won't be accepted and won't be loved. And as social beings, I mean, we're just animals too. The way humans have survived is through community and belonging, right? Like there was tribes when we first became people, right? There was tribes everywhere. And in order to stay within the tribe, everybody has to be able to get along and communicate and live in some way and coexist. So if there's something wrong with me, and if everybody finds out about that thing, they're going to kick me out of the tribe. And then I'm going to be on my own and alone. And we're less likely to survive when we're alone. So what do? We hide that part. So nobody finds out. Because if they find out, we're out. So we hide it. We pretend, we project onto other people, and it develops into a lot of other things. Low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, low self-worth, like we can end up hurting ourselves, addictions, all these things to numb that painful feeling that we have. So it's constantly feeling like we're carrying around this huge secret that we can't let anybody find out about because we're scared if they do, they'll leave us.
That's a great explanation, and I can totally relate. I also, can I presume it's similar to feeling guilt, or they're related a little bit in some way?
Yeah, so they're friends.
Okay.
They definitely hang out a lot.
Okay.
But I think the major difference is that guilt is I did something wrong and I feel bad about it versus I'm wrong. Just me, my existence. There's something wrong with me. And all these emotions serve a purpose. And I think it's really interesting in our society here that uncomfortable emotions we're encouraged to just like push them to the side or numb them or not think about them or just get rid of them because we don't like sitting in that. But every single emotion serves a purpose, right? We wouldn't have these emotions if we didn't need them to survive in some way. Everything we have is like evolutionarily, there's a purpose, right? So guilt, it is a signal. All of our emotions are information. So if I'm feeling guilt, that means I did something that's out of alignment with my values and morals. If I feel shame, it's because it serves the purpose of I still have to live in this group, in this tribe, right? So if I did something wrong to somebody, then there's this shame that comes up, right? Like disappointment or being humiliated, or there's a body part that we feel shameful about. Like there's a piece of it that's healthy. Like when we go through disappointments, there's a spark of shame that comes up because it lets us know how we're connecting with everybody else. It's when there's huge amounts of shame, like neglect or abuse, or just feeling unworthy, that it grows and festers, and then it really impacts our relationships with other people and ourselves. So every emotion has a purpose, and it's just information. And when we have this information and allow ourselves to take it without judgment, then we can actually choose what to do with it and heal and understand ourselves and everybody else in a much better way.
I'm really glad you're bringing it up about being able to open up and not hide your secret anymore, because I'm constantly trying to go back to my missions of still standing together and mental health.
Yeah.
And back to a place where, I grew up a performer, so it takes a lot to embarrass me. I'm very expressive. It takes a lot, but I always had that idea of like I have to have this like perfection complex. Like I always had to appear perfect. So, people would always say, oh, you're so happy, you're so happy. So then when I began doing things with Still Standing Together and talking about how today is not a good day, and these are the things I help to do for myself, and it's like, wait, I don't understand, like other people had trouble understanding it, but I'm glad you're bringing it up, because that's the main purpose of Still Standing Together, is being able to come together and still find the love for one another and accept one another and be there for one another regardless of these emotions that we naturally are going to feel.
Yeah.
So it's that whole idea of acceptance, but also being able to be open about things. So shame must happen a lot more with people that I encounter, and you and I encounter more than I really realize.
Yeah.
So it's a good realization. Now, something I want to touch on with that, going back to your background and things like that, how did you find the value in yourself? Like, what was your own self-discovery journey?
That was a roller coaster. None of this is linear at all, right? And I think that our life journey is more like a circle, because there's layers. And I don't think that we can understand the deepest concept until we peel off the first, the second, the third layer, right? So this wasn't a lot of, like, it was just a process. I think I realized when, in my depressions, is when I would go really dark into a bad spiral, and I couldn't really share it because my family didn't really understand, because there's nothing wrong with me or my life per se, right? I should be happy and grateful and thankful because I'm in America, and I could be in communist Russia. So everything's fine.
Yes.
Why am I crying about anything?
Yeah.
Which I had more shame about. Why do I feel sad? So I think that I'm just a natural learner, and I love learning and being a lifetime student. And so I turned to books. And I'm also an introvert. So that was really hard to put together. I honestly felt like an alien a lot of the time, is that I felt like I didn't belong on this planet, because everyone's outgoing and social and able to get along. And then sometimes I am, and other times I just want to stay inside. So I started researching and looking for books that I could relate to, and I found a book called Quiet, I think, and it was about introverts. And I was like, holy crap, this is me. There's other people like this. And I think that's such a powerful moment to realize that there's other people going through what you're going through, or that have your traits or qualities, and they experience something similar, because back to community, right? There's a tribe out there for us, for all of us, right? Maybe we were just born into a tribe that just doesn't resonate with us, so it gave us this belief that we don't belong in general. And so until we share some of these things, we can't find our tribe. And I just started reading a lot of books, and that's why I loved psychology, because I didn't understand me and how I fit in. And learning about other people helped me understand myself more. And I started to surround myself with people that I admired and that I wanted to be like. Because I kept reading, you are the culmination of the 5 people you spend the most time with, right? So I had a lot of friends who were kind of toxic to me, and it was a codependent relationship, right? So it's not like they were a bad human being, but our combination together created a very unhealthy relationship. And so until I started reaching out to other people that I felt more similar or aligned with, or just felt like they respected my boundaries, that I started to realize, oh, like maybe I have some value to give outside of just helping, right? I also had this complex where I was like, well, if I just make fun of everything and myself, I'll be the funny one, right? So I really took on that funny persona, and I was the class clown in high school, but I'm an introvert. I am terrified of public speaking, yet I became the center of attention in that way. So it's either I was helping or I was making people laugh, which also helps. And I think the more that I shared who I was with other people and traveled, that was really big. Traveling outside the country and meeting all these new perspectives, I was like, wow, there's so many different people. And confidence looks so different on everybody that I was like, okay, like maybe it's okay to be different. And then it went from maybe it's a good thing to be different to, wow, I'm really grateful that I'm different. And then I started embracing all of my culture and me being a hybrid. I was like, I have an advantage. I can connect with a lot more people and help more people. But also, I bring value to relationships too. Not just because I'm helping or I'm funny, but because I'm just there, right? Like, there's other parts of me that are great that I didn't really acknowledge before. So I think having those connections with other people that make us feel nourished and not drained is really important.
There are so many great points that you bring up. One being too that, not, one of the questions I had for you was about what happens if you're around toxic people, since you do deal a lot with people in relationships. So that's a great explanation of how to help yourself if you do find yourself in toxic relationships. But some of the other things too that you brought up about confidence, because I would assume, because I've done that approach before too, where you make people laugh, you make fun of yourself, but I'd assume that slowly it was chipping away at your confidence.
Oh yeah.
And really, when we all think about it, we all have differences in some way, but you're right, because of who you are makes it that much more special. Like, in whatever situation you're in or relationship you're in, just the fact that it's you there is going to bring a lot of value. So I love that you brought all of that up. And something I want to add too that has like saved me for years, and that I always try to encourage people to say, especially those who try to like make fun of themselves to kind of, for whatever reasons. I remember reading a quote and it said, don't be the one to point out what's wrong with you before anybody else can. And so I always think of that when I want to kind of resort to like, oh, my hair looks funny today and I'm afraid they're going to judge me. So before they can judge me, I'm going to say, oh, I know my hair looks funny today, but nobody really notices it. And if they do, oh well, like,
yeah.
But then it's going back to that whole gratitude thing, and I'm grateful for that. So bringing us back to that gratitude piece, because there are people who feel shame. So I want you to kind of help them out there, because I found myself saying this, and I found my friends saying this, where, we do have feelings, we have frustrations, we vent about them, but then something happens tragically in the news or to somebody we know, and we're like, oh, oh my, I'm taking for granted all these, you feel shame that you felt frustration when other people might have it worse than you do at that moment.
Yeah.
So is there anything you can kind of add to that? Because it now that I'm thinking about it, it kind of breaks my heart to hear us all talk like that, even though it's a way of showing compassion for the other people and appreciate what we have. But at the same time, it's also bringing on more shame in our lives, if that makes sense at all.
It does, yeah. And I think when we play that game where, well, they had it worse or their situation is way bigger than mine, we dismiss ourselves, we dismiss our feelings, and we invalidate our feelings. Everyone's allowed to exist. It doesn't always have to be in comparison to somebody else, right? Like, I mean, growing up, everything was, we had it worse. This is nothing compared to you, right? And then we end up feeling like we don't even deserve to feel what we're feeling. And that's so dangerous, because that just keeps all of it locked up in a box. We still feel it, we're still experiencing it, but we just shove it somewhere else and it comes up in an illness or something else. So I think that allow yourself to feel it, right? You don't have to compare it to somebody else. If you're feeling sad or you're feeling shame or anything, your situation is really tough, it's tough. Like, that's it. It's a standalone thing. You're allowed to feel upset about that. And when things happen that seem bigger than our situation, allow it to give you perspective, that you can feel grateful for the things you do have, but not to dismiss your feelings and say, well, mine don't matter then. Because that's also a boundary issue, right? We're allowing someone else's feelings to overtake ours. So acknowledge your feelings. You're allowed to have them. There's nothing wrong with that. And someone else is allowed to go through a hard thing too. And whether they think theirs is bigger or not doesn't matter. That's them projecting if they end up telling you that yours isn't as big, because they want theirs acknowledged more.
And talk about a bit more about projection, because you and I, before we started, we were talking about projection, and once I learned about this, when I was doing it, but also being able to recognize when other people are doing it. It allowed me to have a little bit more compassion for them, but
Mm-hmm.
also not take on or be so hard on myself. So, explain a little bit about projection.
So, projection is basically when we have unprocessed emotions and feelings about something and we don't know how to deal with them, or we haven't really explored it more, but we still feel it. And so we end up placing it on somebody else. And I think the biggest thing that helped me not take things personally when people are rude or mean or say things to me is that it's really their own stuff coming up, right? The way people treat you is a lot less about you and more about them. So if I walk into a room and for some reason someone comes up to me and is being rude or makes a nasty comment about my hair or outfit, right? That just tells me they're feeling really insecure about themselves right now and they don't want to face that. So it's easier to put it on somebody else and take it off of us. Instead of sitting with it and processing it, it's like getting rid of it. Like, I'm just going to throw it on you and now you have it and I don't have to deal with it anymore. But that's very temporary and it doesn't fix anything or it doesn't help you heal. So it's really just misplacing our unprocessed emotions onto somebody else.
That's a great explanation. So now I want to get into, because we're coming towards the end, and I definitely want to talk about overcoming shame. You've made a lot of decisions, in spite of cultural differences and conflicts and things like that. So I know you mentioned journaling earlier,
Mm-hmm.
but are there any other tools that helped you to overcome the shame and go for what you want and go for these decisions?
I think what helped me, and I don't want to say overcome because I still have it, right? I think that when we process and work through these things, we don't get rid of them. It's not getting rid of these emotions, it's creating a new relationship with them and how we see them and managing them, right? So I'm still scared of public speaking. It still terrifies me, and I still have some level of social anxiety. But the difference is that I don't let it stop me from doing things, because then I would be really sad about not being able to live a very fulfilling life and letting it hinder me in my growth. So I think the biggest things that have helped me is visualizing. So I meditate a lot. Meditating, journaling, and having a support system have been crucial in just my own mental health, because having a support system, we need community because we're social beings, right? So we have to find our tribe, and that's hard. So I think it's finding people that you feel safe around, and I could talk about that for days of figuring out how someone's safe for you. Um, but finding people who are supportive and that you're cheerleaders, right? They're in your ear telling you all the time, like a pep talk, like, you got this, you know you can do it. They remind you of all the good things that you're forgetting in that moment. And I think meditating is so important because it allows us to create distance and space between our thoughts and our reactions and who we think we are, right? Because so often we just react to whatever's happening to us, and there's not a lot of control there. And it's not a very thought out way to do something or respond. So when we meditate, it gives us training for our brain to watch a thought, watch a feeling without judging it and just observing it, taking in that information, and then being thoughtful about how you want to respond or move forward. So it's giving me control over not spiraling thoughts, and that breathing is so important because our body gets activated in that fight or flight in those moments. So all of it is just helping our body feel like we're safe so that we have enough space and distance to make a thoughtful decision. And then also visualizing has really been helpful, because when we spiral, we think of the very worst, right? And we can see it and we can feel it, and it's detailed and it's vivid of all the things we don't want to happen. But we can also visualize how we want it to feel and how we want it to look and create that whole scenario. And your body and mind can't tell the difference between what's actually happening versus a thought or an image in your brain. So if you are feeding your thought this visualization that you are succeeding or you're connecting with people and people are accepting you, then your body gets used to that feeling and what it's like, and then it means that it can happen in real life. It's a possibility. So anytime I'm going into a really stressful situation or I'm nervous about how it's going to go, I take time to meditate, and I also take time to visualize how I want it to go, because then I'm going into it with the right mindset of this could happen. This is very well a pleasant experience, and something nice and surprising could come about, instead of everything's going to be horrible and then I'm going to be on edge and then I'm naturally probably going to make it go horrible, right? Because I'm nervous about all of it. So it's just whatever we're already thinking and feeling is going to come out that way. So it's also projection, right? So we're just projecting how we want it to go in a positive way.
So projection can be done in a positive way.
Yeah.
Wow. This has been, I'm just so grateful for you to be open and share as much as you have about yourself and all these tools on shame and worth and value and different things like that, because it's just really eye-opening. It really is. So thank you.
Well, thank you for creating a safe space where I feel comfortable too. I appreciate that.
So if you can leave us with, some sort of affirmation or positive thought or self-talk for our listeners to go on still standing strong.
Mm-hmm. What I tell myself is that even when I'm scared, even when I'm terrified, do it anyway. Because we're not going to stop feeling scared. We're not going to stop feeling fear. And if we wait for our fear to be gone before doing something, you're never going to do it. So I've just realized I can be scared and I'm just going to do it anyway.